Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. So as we reported last week, the United States charged members of government officials, members of Sinaloa's state government, with drug trafficking in Mexico. We're going to update you on the latest on this case in a moment, but a little later in the program, we're speaking with the director of Proceso Pacífico and historian Dr. Ev Meade about the ramifications of those charges and what it could mean going forward for the U.S. and Mexico as both countries kind of go back and forth publicly about counter-drug operations. So stay tuned for that. But first, let's take a look at what's trending across the border, starting with former President Bill Clinton delivered poignant remarks on Friday as he welcomed the newest citizens of the United States. Clinton attended a naturalization ceremony in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he praised the dedication of the new American citizens and hoping they're a sign of a brighter tomorrow. After taking their oath of allegiance, the 42nd President of the United States addressed the group discussing politics, the current state of the nation, and sharing advice for those newest citizens.
We're going to have to find a way to stand up for what we believe without hating people who disagree with us. That's what's going on all over today. Everybody has to decide which is better, cooperation or conflict, addition or subtraction. I don't think it's a close question.
The naturalization ceremony held at the Clinton Presidential Center has become an annual event. Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law a new set of congressional lines that could give his party up to 4 U.S. House seats during the November general elections. DeSantis' signature caps off a fast-tracked redistricting special session, which marked Republicans' last chance to draw new maps in the mid-decade national redistricting battle. The new House map aims to boost Florida's GOP congressional delegation from 20 to 24 seats, while reducing Democrats' 8 seats down to 4. Last week, both the Florida House and Senate passed the congressional lines just one day after panels in both chambers advanced that map. In Central California, workers have been switching signs on major roads. Those streets were once named Cesar Chavez Boulevard. His name is being removed after claims he sexually assaulted young girls and women, including his United Farm Workers co-founder, Dolores Huerta. Watch.
The clock is ticking on Cesar Chavez Boulevard. City crews are already at work replacing street signs across Fresno as California, Ventura, and Kings Canyon return.
I think it's long overdue. We've been waiting for this for quite some time.
The change comes after the Fresno City Council voted in March to remove the Cesar Chavez name from the streets following allegations of sexual abuse against the civil rights leader. Los Panchos restaurant has sat along Kings Canyon for more than 3 decades.
We've been here 32 years. We've always been Kings Canyon. So to be able to change back to Kings Canyon, that's who we are as a business and as a community.
City officials sent letters to residents and businesses in April notifying them of the changes.
The name change and our public works sign crew started work this morning. We expect to finish by mid next week.
The city is also working to notify navigation apps about the change.
With some of the navigation apps, some of those I know from experience when we went through that in the past, some segments got changed more quickly.
The city says it expects digital maps to update soon, but there's no exact timeline for when apps like Google Maps will fully reflect the new street names.
I was driving home and I was like, wait, it's Kings Canyon now. I'm like, I don't know where this changed. It's like, It's confusing.
And for business owners, the transition goes far beyond street signs.
Insurance companies that you have to deal with again, your bank account, just different vendors. It's a long ordeal process that, that requires time and, of course, money.
Now, the allegations against Chavez came out earlier this year after the New York Times published interviews with Huerta and the other women. Chavez's name is being removed from streets, schools, memorials, and other locations throughout California and many parts of the United States. 2 members of Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum's party in the northwestern Sinaloa state said they would temporarily step down from their posts. This comes after the United States charged them and 8 other politicians and security officers with drug trafficking. The indictment against the 10 has shaken Mexico's political establishment. In a short video announcement at midnight on Friday, Governor Ruben Rocha Moya, the highest-ranking official named in the indictment, denied accusations that he protected the Sinaloa cartel and helped it smuggle vast quantities of drugs into the United States in exchange for political support and millions of dollars in bribes. And that brings us to our guest for today's program. We've had him here before to explain similar circumstances and, of course, violence across the country of Mexico. Our director of Proceso Pacífico, Dr. Ev Meade, joining us today. Thanks so much for joining us, Ev.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Rudy.
So I wanted to start kind of going backwards a little bit. Those indictments were unsealed last week, but along with those indictments, the U.S. actually sent multiple extradition requests to Mexico. Since then, and actually that same day, we heard from President Claudia Sheinbaum that said Mexico is first going to take a look at that evidence through its own prosecutors before taking action. We have seen some extraditions in recent history. How typical is this process of kind of reviewing the evidence first before making any determinations on extradition? And what does it tell us about how this instance could play out?
Well, I think if you look at the extradition treaty, it's perfectly normal for the state that receives the request to ask for some evidence and to make their own assessment. In fact, the treaty even gives them the option of filing their own charges. So in other words, if Mexico decides to deny the extradition, under the treaty, they can do that if they file their own charges. That's pretty normal. I would say I think there's a cautionary tale here too. If you look at the history with regard to these big drug trafficking syndicates and the Sinaloa cartel in particular, the non-extradition has had some huge implications. So, for example, if you look at the former governor of Veracruz, Javier Duarte Ochoa, perhaps the most corrupt governor in Mexican history, ran an administration that embezzled, some say, on the order of $3 billion from the people there, covered for drug cartels. They had basically an industry of death and disappearance. Just the numbers are just staggering. Mass graves with hundreds of people, et cetera, et cetera. He faced justice in Mexico. He got a 9-year sentence from money laundering, which was just about up. His 6 closest associates, against whom there's tons of evidence that they actually facilitated this, walked scot-free after a year. His wife, Karime Macias, lives in a nice flat in London. She supposedly walked off with millions of dollars, got political asylum there, and the UK has refused to extradite her. So, that's one case, and admittedly, it's an extreme case. And then, if you look at the drug trafficking cases, El Chapo Guzman's never going to leave prison in the United States. The Beltran Leyvas who've been arrested, they're never going to leave prison in the United States. If you look at a case like Rafael Caro Quintero, who was extradited to the United States a year ago, he's never going to leave prison in the United States. But his case is another kind of cautionary tale. He was arrested in 1985. And a lower court judge in Mexico let him walk scot-free in 2023. And before the federal government of Mexico, in 2013, before the federal government of Mexico could file charges and rearrest him, he started a new drug cartel and launched a whole wave of terror in the state of Sonora and along the U.S.-Mexico border. So when the U.S. and Mexico collaborate on these things, there's a pretty good record of, providing justice. When they don't, and when Mexico kind of has gone it alone, particularly under previous governments, it hasn't gone so well. And I think it's really worth considering that seriously. This is also a case without precedent. Mm-hmm. I mean, to have a sitting governor, a sitting senator, a sitting mayor of a capital city, a former cabinet member, and 4 high-ranking law enforcement officials indicted in the U.S. like this. I mean, that's the other thing, is this is kind of without precedent in that sense, that all of them, not after the administration, but right smack in the middle of their administration. This is uncharted territory too. And I think it's fair to give everybody a minute to kind of digest it.
Something you mentioned, the unprecedented territory when it comes to going after and indicting these sitting officials in the middle of their terms in Mexico. But another rarity is, seeing these government officials in those indictments tied to actual violence.
Absolutely. And, and this is so rare, even in the drug trafficking cases, when El Chapo was indicted, for example, and he had indictments in 5 different places in the United States that they finally consolidated into one. In the very first indictment that they published, they included a couple of acts of violence, 2 police officers whose murder he orchestrated. But by the time he went to trial, they kind of cut those out. And I always think, for the thousands or tens of thousands of victims of these organizations, it's really bittersweet to see them basically caught on, tax evasion and drug trafficking and financial crimes, and never really called to account for the violence itself. This indictment has a very specific set of acts of violence. It is mostly the part that relates to the guy who goes by the nickname of Juanito, which is this police commander, Valenzuela Millán, who killed or orchestrated the killing, I should say. I think El Nini, the head of security for the Sinaloa cartel, actually did it. But they say, the U.S. claims that he killed Alexander Mesa Leon, who was a confidential informant for the Department of Justice, who was collecting information against the cartel, killed him, but also kidnapped, tortured, and killed unnamed members of his family. I mean, it's very specific in October of 2023. And I'm so glad that that's in the indictment, just because there's so many people that I know in Culiacan and in Sinaloa who've lost family members and colleagues for whom the justice, for these very bureaucratic or the trafficking crimes, I mean, it's important that people are taken off the street and, tried and lose their liberty, but not to even have the victims' names mentioned in most of these cases is really, really striking. So yeah, that's something really unique. It's a very specific accusation there, and they kind of lay out how it's connected to various characters in the story. In other words, sort of how police corruption works and results in a witness being killed.
With such a strong mention of, having a hand in murder and in violence in these indictments, do you think that tells us a little bit about how developed or strong the evidence is behind the scenes?
Well, yeah, I think there's sort of 2 pieces to that. One is you do have to think about the strategy of the prosecution, because part of what they do in all of these cases, all the kingpin cases, is they charge as many people with as many offenses as possible. And then what they always hope to do is flip. So take the lower down ones and see if they can get them to negotiate a lesser offenses. In other words, taking them off the indictment or indicting them for lower offenses in order to get them to give information on the higher ups. So I think that's clearly at play in this case, and it may be somebody like, for example, the mayor of Culiacan. There's very little about him in this indictment, and it might be that what they're trying to do is pressure him to give up some more information on those higher up in the indictment. Some of this information probably came from the drug trafficking indictments of the last couple of years, the arrest of El Mayo Zambada, the arrest of Ovidio Guzman. It may be part of their ongoing negotiations with the Justice Department. So that's the strategic side. On the other side, yeah, I think the quality of evidence is, all this evidence, I think it's strong, what I would say, particularly for an initial indictment. For example, they included photographs of this box of cash with the lists of names which they claim is the monthly bribes paid to officials in and around Culiacan on behalf of the Chapitos and Chapo's sons and the main faction of the Sinaloa cartel. Now, it needs to be contextualized because all the names on that list are nicknames. So they need to, present witnesses and evidence that show which nickname corresponds to which person and what were they're going to have to reveal how they came across these lists and this box of cash, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of stuff that would still need to be proved. But boy, it suggests that they have really strong evidence. The last piece that I would say is this whole thing begins with this story that the governor of Sinaloa has never been able to explain. And the federal government has so far stood behind him, but they've never been able to explain it either. And that's this event that kind of kicked the whole thing off. So on July 25th, 2024, El Mayo Zambada, many of your viewers and readers of the news will know, he was arrested in a very peculiar way, basically kidnapped, put on a private plane by members of the Chapitos, who then flew him to the United States and surrendered, and he was arrested. Okay? Well, the other piece of that incident was that El Mayo claims, and others have kind of reinforced this claim, that he was tricked into a meeting. And he was supposed to meet with Ruben Rocha Moya, the governor of Sinaloa, and Hector Melesio Cuen, who was an old friend of both of them and who had been a political ally of Rocha Moya's until about a year and a half before, when they'd fallen out and had basically become his staunchest political rival in Sinaloa. The outcome of that meeting was El Mayo kidnapped and taken to the United States, and Hector Melesio Cuen, ally of El Mayo, murdered. The fallout was enormous because the state authorities in Sinaloa tried to claim that Cuen was murdered in a robbery attempt at a gas station. As soon as federal officials came and started investigating, they revealed that that was just a flat lie, and the prosecutor actually resigned. They said, yes, he was killed at the same meeting. The governor of Sinaloa claimed he was in the United States, and he provided a flight log of his plane saying he'd gone to Los Angeles. The inconvenient part is the Department of Homeland Security and ICE said pretty clearly very early on they had no record of him entering the United States. That's pretty damning. Makes it look like he lied. And he has never explained that. And the federal government who's defending him have never explained that. It's not to say an explanation doesn't exist. I'm not trying the case, but I'm saying that for lots of people, it's like, well, wait a second. He seems to have been at this event where his main political rival was murdered, and the leader of the other faction of the cartel that he's now accused of basically going after on their behalf was kidnapped and taken to the United States. It seems like a pretty huge coincidence. And that you'd have to actually get out there affirmatively and explain what was going on if that's not what happened. And he's never done that.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about Governor Ruben Rocha Moya's involvement with the current federal administration in just a moment. We're speaking with Dr. Ev Meade, director of Proceso Pacífico, about these indictments against sitting Mexican officials that were unsealed last week. So stay with us. We'll Report Live is back in 2 minutes. This edition of Border Report Live. We are joined today by the director of Proceso Pacífico, Dr. Ev Meade, to talk about these indictments against sitting officials in the country of Mexico, all related to drug trafficking. We were talking about Ruben Rocha Moya before the break, Ev, and one of the things that he said back when those indictments were unsealed last week was, pardon me, he called these indictments essentially an attack on Mexico's sovereignty, and he used that exact words, the Mexico's sovereignty. How powerful is that argument politically inside Mexico? And also, he was a close ally of former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. mentor of current President Claudia Sheinbaum. How does this all make the political calculus turn out for her right now?
Well, it's pretty bad for her. I mean, because it's put her in this, they've taken a really defensive posture. I mean, she has basically has accused the media of lynching Ruben Rocha Moya without evidence, and trying to claim that he's owed all kinds of confidentiality and discretion. I mean, I find that really striking that they haven't found a way to kind of cut bait on this one. Omar Garcia Harfuch, who's the very popular and by most accounts very effective security minister for Mexico, came out and said, "Look, we, the federal government, are in charge of security in Sinaloa, and we didn't suspect him." So that's pretty striking. And it may be that there's a lot more there. And that there's a whole bunch more context that has to come out, and that a lot of these different acts are in a gray zone. They're not as black and white as they seem. I believe that there's probably plenty of that. But the basic question and their defensiveness very early on, that fuels conspiracy theories. There are lots of people that think Rocha Moya has all kinds of dirty laundry on Andres Manuel López Obrador. And some of the things that people say are probably just rumors and myths made up, but we don't know. And look, it's always true with extraditions. I mean, look, some of this stuff may very well be evidence that comes from convicted soon to be convicted drug traffickers who lie for a living and make conspiracies for a living. Totally, absolutely, totally fair claim. I do think, though, that the claim that Sheinbaum is making about due process, I think, is preemptive. I mean, he's been indicted. He's not been convicted. Mm-hmm. And there is an opportunity to present some evidence, but it is just not true to say that there isn't some pretty public circumstantial evidence against him at this point, and he hasn't had much of an answer for it. So I think, too, in terms of the relationship between the two countries, I mean, I think it's much better for the U.S. to pursue as collaborative as possible with Mexico, but to pursue prosecutions. I mean, think about the alternative. Look at what's going on off the coast in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, where, you want to talk about no due process. Well, blowing up boats and destroying all the evidence of people you accuse of drug trafficking. If that's the alternative, this is a heck of a lot better. He'll be treated fairly in the United States, and he's entitled to a fair trial. But I guess that initial evidence they've put out is it seems pretty strong. Again, it's circumstantial, and again, you have to know where it came from. He has an absolute right to interrogate, the source of that evidence and contextualize it, but it doesn't look very good. On the other side of it too, I think for Sheinbaum, and I think this was a question for AMLO, they have to decide if they're going to try to govern like a social movement. Mm-hmm. These guys all came out of Morena, which was an insurgent movement, and they had a lot of friends who were persecuted by the old regime, and AMLO had a lot of colleagues who were murdered in southern Mexico. But at this point, they're not a social movement anymore. They're the state. They're the government of strong and wealthy country that matters in the world, and they need to act more like it. And that would be my advice to them. And if there's substantial evidence against the governor, let him have a fair trial. Or if you have evidence in the federal government of Mexico, they should release it. They need to talk to people. And I think the sovereignty stuff, I think they're overplaying it. I think there's a history of kind of Mexican nationalism in the front in the United States that she's been very good at pulling up at the right time. I think they're misreading this one, particularly in Sinaloa. People have been living in a state of siege since the 9th of September 2024 there, with an informal curfew, shootouts every night, every branch of the federal military and government patrolling the streets. People are absolutely tired of this. Rocha Moya has been the guy who's been telling people, oh, no pasa nada, everything's fine, go back to school, go back to work, and it just doesn't ring true anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's time to answer for that.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into, my final question, because we are running out of time here. But, overall, you have your thumb on the pulse of what the people on the streets of places like Culiacan, Sinaloa overall are saying. What does this do to the public trust, not just there in Sinaloa, but more broadly across the whole country?
Well, I think the security thing is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and I think people have grown frustrated with it. The federal government is very popular. The anti-poverty programs have been really successful, but security is the one thing. They have not really they've had some impressive arrests. I think they've collaborated really well, at least the professional prosecutors and law enforcement with the United States. But they haven't gotten the level of violence in the places like Sinaloa, like big parts of the state of Jalisco. They haven't been able to rein that in. They haven't succeeded there. And they've got to come up with some kind of strategy of success there. And it can't just be mano dura. It can't just be, an iron fist. We're going to crack down on everybody, declare war on everybody. People are tired of that. They want, a different solution. And I think moving some of this stuff to courtrooms in the United States, that might actually be a good option for them. They're going to have to recalibrate how they think about that. But they also have to deal with those other questions, because there's a long-running current. Like if you just ask people about the government in Sinaloa, you could pick any time in the last 20 years. They're all going to tell you that they're all corrupt, right? It doesn't mean anything. That's just an empty signifier. But right now, the context is things have gotten dramatically worse. And because they've gotten dramatically worse, people are willing to consider options that they wouldn't have considered a couple of years ago.
And we've been speaking with Director of Proceso Pacífico, Dr. Ev Meade. As always, when we speak to him, we are unfortunately out of time. This conversation could have gone on another hour, but we appreciate you joining us today, Ev.
Thanks a lot for having me, Rudy. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. That is going to do it for us today. Thank you so much for watching.